Let's jump right in. Today, we're looking at the most deadly U.S. natural disaster of the last century. On September 20th, 2017, a Category 4 hurricane named Maria made landfall on the eastern coast of Puerto Rico. But you know the full story of what happened there? It goes way beyond just wind and rain.
If you were watching the news in the days right after the storm, this is the number you saw: 64. That was the official death toll released by the government. And honestly, it paints a picture of a tragic but somewhat contained immediate aftermath from a powerful storm.
But then we look at the reality: 2,975. That is a staggering number. And understanding the massive gap between these two figures, that's where we uncover a completely hidden tragedy. It's the story of what actually happens when a natural disaster triggers a total, prolonged infrastructure collapse. So the official narrative we were all fed was about a severely destructive hurricane, right? But the hidden reality is that the fall of 2017 wasn't just a weather event. It was a massive systemic failure. It was a hurricane followed by literally the longest blackout in American history. And that was followed by a year of dying that the government simply refused to count for a very long time.
Don't forget us. Just don't forget us. To truly grasp the weight of this desperate plea from the people on the ground, we actually need to hit rewind. We've got to look at the island's condition before the storm even arrived, because that's the only way to understand why the aftermath got so incredibly bad.
Part 1, a grid destined to fail.
Here's the thing: Puerto Rico, which is home to 3.5 million American citizens, was critically wounded before Maria ever formed. Hurricane Irma, a massive Category 5, had grazed the island just 2 weeks prior. It knocked out power to over 1 million people, leaving the electrical grid hanging by an absolute thread. Plus, PRPA, the public utility responsible for that grid, had been bankrupt for 3 months. They were relying on wooden transmission poles dating back to the 1960s, strung up through really tough mountainous terrain. You add in years of deferred maintenance and incredibly thin generator fuel supplies, the stage was perfectly set for total collapse.
Part 2, the monster makes landfall.
Okay, so with repair crews already working around the clock just to fix the damage from Irma, an absolute worst-case scenario is brewing out in the Atlantic. On September 16th, a tropical depression forms. By the 18th, it undergoes one of the most rapid intensifications ever recorded in the Atlantic basin, exploding from 85 to 160 miles per hour in less than 24 hours. The next day, it plows right into the island of Dominica as a Category 5, literally scraping the city clean. It was so bad the prime minister had to evacuate through a hole in his roof. And finally, on September 20th at 5:51 a.m., the monster makes landfall in Puerto Rico.
Now, what's genuinely terrifying about the hours right before it hit is a meteorological event called an eye wall replacement cycle. Basically, the storm's original eye wall collapses, and a new, much larger one forms around it. This is a big deal because it meant the storm weakened slightly to a high-end Category 4, but it doubled the size of its most destructive winds. A wider eye wall meant absolutely no corner of the island was safe.
To put a real human face to those 155-mile-per-hour winds, think about Carlos Bonilla Rodriguez over in Yabucoa. He watched through a window from a neighbor's house as his own roof just peeled back and totally disappeared into the storm. And Carlos was actually one of the lucky ones, just because he was sheltering somewhere that still had walls. Outside, rivers were turning into brown floods, carrying houses, cars, and refrigerators straight out of the mountains. Every single one of Puerto Rico's 78 municipalities got hit.
Part 3, the longest American blackout.
So by 2 p.m., the eye exits the northwest coast, the wind dies down, and this eerie silence falls over the whole island. But here is the crazy part. While Washington is getting early news of a serious storm and trying to coordinate a response over satellite phones, the reality on the ground was purely desperate. Every hospital was running on generators. Every dialysis center was closed. Every single traffic light was dark. People who literally relied on machines to stay alive were suddenly dependent on a tiny amount of generator fuel that had to somehow travel down non-existent, washed-out roads.
This was the silent aftermath. For the first 12 hours, almost zero information got out. Cell towers were completely down. We're talking a total island-wide power outage. Interior roads were entirely blocked by mudslides, fallen trees, and collapsed houses. And federal estimates showed that a full week after the storm, only 11 of Puerto Rico's 69 hospitals had electricity or fuel. Just think about that. Refrigerated medications spoiled, oxygen concentrators stopped, Operating rooms couldn't be sterilized. The storm was over, but the real disaster was just getting started.
In this massive vacuum of communication, help wasn't coming from the government, it came from neighbors. Take Coast Guard Petty Officer Osiris Torres. He literally stepped right out his front door into Category 4 horizontal rain to rescue a trapped elderly neighbor. He brought her back to his place to ride out the storm, went straight back to his job the next morning, and get this, he never even filed an after-action report for his heroism. Everyday people and community organizers in San Juan just stepped up. They fed each other and cleared their own streets.
For so many, it was a raw fight for survival. Over in Aguadilla, Zidra and Juan Carlos floated on a patched-up air mattress for 16 grueling hours, while rising floodwaters made their home physically collapse around them. When the rain finally stopped, they were rescued by neighbors and had to walk for miles through total devastation. The federal aid that did eventually arrive was heavily delayed, undersized, and incredibly unevenly distributed. Survivors really only had each other to rely on.
Part 4. Uncovering the true cost. As weeks slowly turned into months, that official death toll of 64 and the grim reality on the ground drifted completely apart. It took 328 days to fully restore power across the island. That is 11 months. It stands as the second longest blackout in modern world history. If you look at total customer hours of power lost, it was over 3 times larger than the next biggest blackout the U.S. had ever experienced. And the human cost of those 328 days is absolutely heartbreaking. Look at Ivan Luciano. He lost power at an Arecibo hospital after being transferred for dialysis complications. And because that hospital lost power and its generators failed, he died on October 3rd. Across the entire island, people weren't dying from the initial wind or the water anymore. They were dying because the life-saving infrastructure they depended on had completely failed them.
Orlando Lopez Martinez is another tragic example of the systemic breakdown. He was receiving rationed dialysis, getting less than half of what he actually needed, all because his clinic just couldn't get enough generator fuel. He passed away on October 10th. But here's the kicker. His death certificate listed a heart attack brought on by kidney failure. It didn't mention Hurricane Maria anywhere. This tragic misclassification of systemic failure is exactly how the official death toll stayed frozen at a mere 64 for almost an entire year.
It ultimately took independent researchers to expose what was really going on. An August 2018 study from George Washington University looked at excess mortality and estimated 2,975 deaths. A totally separate Harvard study estimated it could actually be closer to 4,600. It took these massive academic studies to finally back the government of Puerto Rico into a corner, forcing them to revise their official count to 2,975. And that happened 1 full year later. The truth quite literally had to be forced onto the official documents.
The core truth of this entire tragedy really boils down to this. The storm passed in a single morning. The dying took 11 months. Hurricane Maria didn't just take lives in the immediate chaotic fury of 155-mile-per-hour winds. It slowly erased them over the better part of a year through systematic neglect and the utter failure of modern infrastructure. Which leaves us with a really vital question to consider today. When natural disasters trigger catastrophic infrastructure failures, who is truly accountable for the lives lost in the silent aftermath? As we look back at the deadliest U.S. natural disaster of the last century, we really have to ask ourselves how we can ensure these forgotten stories are not only remembered, but never, ever repeated. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it gave you some real perspective on the true depth of what happened out there.